All right, I think we'll get started. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar on how to craft a successful proposal to Arnold Ventures for rigorous impact evaluations of student success programs and practices in higher education. I'm Shrutika Sabharwal. I'm a manager on the evidence-based policy team at Arnold Ventures, and Jessica and Amanda will be the primary presenters today. Before that, I just want to start with a few logistical items. The first is I also want to introduce Leah Mosen, who's an analyst on our team and is managing the back end of this. So if participants have any technical difficulties or other queries, please message her directly. I also want to make note of the Q&A box. We will be using this rather than the general chat for any questions and answers. So all participants are muted since this is a webinar format, but you should feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be answering them at the end of the presentation. We will also follow up after the webinar to share a copy of this presentation with everyone who has registered. And I do want to note that this webinar is being recorded. We'll be happy to share the recording with anyone who requests it, and to do so, you can email Leah or respond to the invitation that you received or a follow-up email that we'll send with the slides as well. So that's it on the logistical items. I now want to pass this to Amanda and Jessica, who will discuss the request for proposals, along with tips for a successful submission. And participants can also find a link to the RFP in the chat that Leah has. So please take it away, Amanda.
Great, thank you, Shrutika, and welcome everyone. So my name is Amanda Moderson-Cox. I'm the Director of Evidence-Based Policy here at Arnold Ventures, and I lead our evidence-based policy team's work to build evidence for and expand access to programs in all policy areas that have been shown to meaningfully improve outcomes in well-conducted randomized controlled trials. So this means that our team is both a funder and an avid consumer of RCT evaluations in multiple policy areas. And we're thrilled to be partnering with our higher education colleagues on this particular request for proposals to evaluate programs to improve student success in higher education. Over the years, we've read and have been a part of supporting many rigorous evaluations in this area. And we're looking forward to building more to continue identifying what works to improve the lives of students as they move through our system of post-secondary education and into the workforce. So I'll pass it over to Jessica, who will introduce herself and her team and take it from here.
Thanks, Amanda. It's great to see some familiar names in attendance. Sad I can't see y'all's faces, but as Amanda mentioned, my name is Jessica Takeda, and I'm the Higher Ed Manager at AV, and I oversee our higher education portfolio to advance higher education quality and accountability. Our higher education initiative provides investments in research, policy, advocacy, and litigation to improve the return on investment for students and taxpayers in higher education. As part of this, we seek to identify and scale effective practices that improve student success and address equity gaps in higher education. First, I just want to give an overview of all things Arnold Ventures. Leia's slide, sorry. AV is a philanthropy that has a core mission to invest in evidence-based solutions that maximize opportunity and minimize injustice. Arnold Ventures' mission is to identify and support lasting policy and systemic change that improves people's lives. We do this by investing in research and building a strong body of evidence to drive public conversation that can be used to craft policy and really inspire action. Our organization works in 4 areas, which include criminal justice, health, education, and public finance, and we use tools of research, policy advocacy, and strategic communication to identify, inform, and advance policy change. Next, I want to dive into some of the goals of this RFP. So we launched this request for proposal last month to actively solicit ideas for rigorous impact evaluations of post-secondary student success programs and practices. As mentioned by Amanda, this RFP is a joint effort between the Higher Ed Initiative and the Evidence-Based Policy Initiative within AV. The goal of this RFP is to really increase the number of programs and practices that are backed by rigorous causal evidence of effectiveness to help pave the way for success among all students, especially those that have been underserved by the current higher ed system. This evidence has become even more important as there have been increased investments in college completion efforts. The Department of Ed recently launched the College Completion Fund, which supports evidence-based activities to improve post-secondary retention and completion rates at colleges. We especially encourage colleges that have received college completion funds to apply for this RFP, but it is open to all. We want to help ensure that colleges have a full suite of programs that are backed by strong causal evidence of effectiveness and are available for them to implement. In recent years, a number of high-quality randomized controlled trial evaluations have identified several programs with the potential to substantially increase student success. However, we do recognize that more evidence is needed for policymakers, practitioners, and key stakeholders to use in their communities. This RFP will support rigorous impact evaluations, and by that, we primarily mean RCTs. As I'm sure many of you know, an RCT, or experimental evaluation, is a study where individuals, or sometimes clusters of individuals, such as communities or student cohorts, are randomly assigned to either a treatment group that receives some type of intervention or program, or a control group that does not receive the program. What makes RCTs uniquely strong in terms of measuring impact is that the process of random assignment ensures that, on average, there are no differences between the two groups other than having received the program, and therefore we can reasonably be confident that any differences observed from a well-executed RCT are caused by the program being tested. Broadly, AV invests in a range of other types of research studies and designs, from descriptive studies to non-experimental studies of varying methodologies where appropriate. However, for this RFP, as mentioned, we do have a strong preference for funding RCTs. We will also consider certain rigorous quasi-experimental designs that can credibly demonstrate a causal relationship in cases where random assignment is not feasible. In these cases, the grantee will need to demonstrate that random assignment is truly not feasible. So we wanted to start by giving folks a sense of previous investments in rigorous research in the areas of higher ed. Overall, AV has funded 35 RCTs, or quasi-experimental studies, totaling over $12 million. The average grant award is about $350,000, with 80% falling under $500,000. These investments have ranged from $60,000 up to $1 million. And the duration of these studies averages around 4.5 years, ranging anywhere between 1 and 10 years. We mentioned this to y'all to give a ballpark sense of our expectations about the size and duration of study budgets. Finally, we typically provide primary funding to universities and evaluation firms, but we are also open to funding implementers directly. Our grantees are typically nonprofit 501c3s. However, we can fund other types of organizations, though it just might require additional reporting. Later in the presentation, Amanda will provide more details with a few examples of higher ed RCTs we have supported to allow you all to get a better idea. Great. So our selection criteria. We have 4 selection criteria we use to assess the LOIs, the letters of interest. I'll talk through each criteria broadly and then pass it to Amanda, who's going to give you some tips for writing a successful proposal with these criteria in mind. First, we are seeking applications to conduct RCTs of programs or interventions that promote success for higher ed students in the United States where that intervention is backed by promising prior evidence suggesting it could produce sizable impacts and important outcomes of clear policy relevance, such as degree or certificate completion, job placement, post-college earnings, or debt burden. Or the intervention is widely adopted in practice, but has not yet been rigorously evaluated. Or the intervention is growing in use and likely to become widely adopted, but has not yet been rigorously evaluated. We especially encourage applications seeking to replicate findings from prior evaluations that are especially promising, but not yet conclusive. These reasons could include the study only measured short-term or immediate outcomes, or was only conducted in a single site, or established the counterfactual with a well-matched comparison group, but not a randomized control group. As mentioned before, the reason we put such a premium on promising prior evidence is that we know from our own experience and from the history of program evaluations that only a small percentage of programs succeed in producing meaningful impacts on the ultimate outcomes they're seeking to prove when they are rigorously evaluated in RCT. Our hope is that by following signs from prior research, we can maximize our chances identifying more programs that are capable of improving outcomes in a meaningful way. Great. So second, we are focused on whether the applicant has proposed a study design that is valid. For example, does the study have a sufficiently large sample and other elements needed to generate credible evidence about the program's impact on one or more of the targeted outcomes of high policy importance? We're looking for applicants to describe primary outcomes of interest, how the outcomes will be measured and over what length of time, and the proposed analysis methods. We strongly encourage designs that measure outcomes in both the short and longer term to determine whether the effects endure long enough to constitute meaningful sustained impacts. The exact follow-up period will really depend on the specifics of the study in question it is seeking to answer. As mentioned earlier, the average follow-up period is 4.5 years, but can range a number of years. To give applicants a sense of what we look for assessing the strength of a proposed study design, our RFP links to a document we prepared called Key Items to Get Right When Conducting RCTs and Social Programs. Leah will also drop it in the chat box so y'all can access it right now. Thanks, Leah. Importantly, we're looking for relatively simple analyses rather than more complex methods. The reason for this is that we want to be able to clearly and transparently convey the findings from the studies we support to policymakers and implementers. As discussed earlier, while this opportunity is generally seeking to fund RCTs, we'll also consider submissions for rigorous quasi or non-experimental evaluations if the applicant can make a convincing case that an RCT is not feasible. Great. Our next criteria is whether the applicant study team includes at least one researcher in a key substantive role who has previously carried out a well-conducted RCT. The reason why we use this criterion is we've seen it from our own experience in monitoring the research literature that there are many ways an RCT can go wrong, and RCTs require training and skill to design and implement successfully. Our view is that to give a study a good chance of being implemented well, someone on the research team should have previous experience implementing an RCT. To assess whether the team meets this criteria, we ask applicants to submit at least one report from a prior RCT in which someone on the proposed study team played a meaningful role. If the proposed design is a quasi-experimental method, the team should submit a prior study which uses similar methodology. We assess those reports to make sure the study was well conducted. For example, that the random assignment resulted in treatment and control groups that were highly similar in baseline characteristics, and that the study was able to collect outcome data for a high percentage of both the treatment and control groups. Additionally, I want to say that we recognize the importance of expanding and diversifying the pool of researchers with experience conducting rigorous evaluations, and do not intend for this criteria to be a barrier to applicants who have good ideas and study designs. Therefore, we strongly encourage researchers who are new to rigorous evaluations, including researchers from racial and ethnic groups that are historically underrepresented in the field of research, to participate in this funding opportunity. We want to underscore that individuals who do not yet meet this requirement themselves may still serve as a study's lead researcher as long as they can collaborate with a colleague who does meet the requirement and will play at least a key advisory role in the study. Again, we don't want this to be a barrier. So if you have questions about whether your study team qualifies, feel free to reach out to us directly to discuss. Great. Okay, lastly, our preference is that AV funding go towards the cost of conducting the evaluation as opposed to covering program delivery or intervention costs. That said, in some cases, our board may agree to fund a portion of the program delivery costs if, one, there is a very compelling reason to evaluate the program, and two, AV's investment in program delivery is necessary for a sufficiently powered study to go forward. Regardless, we look for letters of commitment from other funding partners to ensure that the program will be implemented and thus be able to be evaluated using random assignment. We especially encourage agreements in which necessary parties not only support the study, but also provide a credible description of how they or others would use the findings to inform program and policy decisions. We also look to make sure that all necessary study be in place during the beginning of the funding application process, but we do expect them to be nailed down in advance of making the grant award. Awesome. So before turning it to Amanda, I just want to give you all a sense of our review process. We try and make it as streamlined and easy as possible for both applicants and for our own team. Applications are accepted on a rolling basis, meaning there's no deadline. And we also make grants on a rolling basis throughout the year. Oh, I'm so sorry, my computer just froze.
Are you okay, Jessica? Do you want me to take it from here?
Yeah, sorry, my computer just froze.
No worries. All right, I'm going to jump in just a little bit earlier than planned. Hi, everyone. So just to finish up on the review process. So as Jessica mentioned, no submission deadlines. I think that was a question in the chat. And we do make grants on a rolling basis throughout the year. The way that our initial submissions work is that we're asking for just a 3-page letter of interest to begin with. What we expect to see in that is that the letter of interest primarily addresses the promising or widely adopted intervention and the experienced researcher criteria, and then also provides enough detail on the study design so that we have a general sense of the study's parameters and rigor. We also ask that the LOI provide an indication of the overall funding amount requested, but this can just be an estimate or a range. There's no expectation that you submit a budget at the LOI stage. Additionally, as Jessica mentioned, I think we're not expecting applicants to necessarily have all of the partnerships for program implementation, data collection, and random assignment in place at the LOI stage, but applicants should articulate a clear path or plan towards getting those commitments and details into place. If our reviewers find that the LOI effectively addresses the selection criteria, then we'll go ahead and invite a 6-page full proposal in which we ask participants to address the questions that our reviewers raised about the LOI and to flesh out that discussion about the study design. We do also ask for a detailed budget to be submitted along with the full proposal, and we'll provide you with a template to do so when we invite for a full proposal. On our end, we try to commit to reviewing both the LOI and the full proposal within approximately 1 month of receiving each of them. From that point forward, the process is collaborative. There's often some back and forth with applicants to get clarification on aspects of the project before moving to the next step. I would say that on average, the time from LOI submission to a funding decision from our board ranges from about 4 to 6 months. It can be faster or slower depending on how quickly you get back to us and how many questions we have. And then for projects that are ultimately awarded funding, we do require public pre-registration of the analysis plan, laying out the key elements of the study. And we encourage grantees to share their data to the extent feasible with the broader research community as part of our organization's commitment to research transparency. All right, so now I'm going to talk through a few tips to address our criteria and discuss a few examples of studies that we've funded. So first I'll talk about the promising or widely adopted intervention criterion. The goal for this section is to hopefully offer some helpful advice for submitting a successful proposal to the RFP. So this particular criterion, the promising or widely adopted intervention, is really our most important criterion. I would say that if an LOI can get over this threshold, then we're often inclined to invite a full proposal and maybe address some of the other things at the full proposal stage. Essentially, what we're doing with this criterion is that we're asking you to demonstrate that there's a compelling reason to rigorously evaluate the specific program or intervention that you're proposing to study. And you can do this in one of 2 ways. So the first is to demonstrate that the program has been shown to be sufficiently promising in a prior study. As Jessica was discussing, the reason for this is that a guiding principle behind our work in funding RCTs is that we know that surprisingly few interventions succeed in producing meaningful impacts when they're rigorously evaluated. So we're really trying to improve our odds of finding things that do work by making investments to evaluate programs that already have a strong signal. So we'll ask you to demonstrate this. You can do this by including references in your LOI to the relevant RCTs or other studies that have studied a program that is either the same as or very similar to the program that you're proposing to study. These can be published studies, preprints, or even unpublished preliminary reports. We just ask that you provide either an accurate citation or, even better, send the paper or the report along with your LOI. Of course, we'll keep reports and papers confidential upon request as needed. Then in your LOI, what we'll want you to do is describe the findings of this study or studies, as well as whether and how the program that was evaluated is related to what you're proposing to study. So a caution here is that we sometimes get LOIs that kind of throw out 6 to 8 different references, and it just isn't clear to us how the interventions that were studied in those references are directly relevant to the program that you're proposing to study. And then another note on this is that we generally expect that you will consider and use prior evidence in discussing your study design. So for example, discuss how the target population that you plan to study may be similar or different from that which was studied in the prior evidence, and then how we might expect to see the same or different impacts as a result. We also like to see that you consider the size of the impacts found in the studies that you're citing and benchmark your power calculations with realistic expectations about what effect size can be achieved with the intervention that you're planning to study. Do this by keeping in mind that you'll likely need to discount effect sizes from non-experimental studies, and that's because those found in non-experimental studies are typically larger than those found in RCTs. And or account for the fact that, for example, a replication RCT often finds smaller effects than those found in the original study. Okay, so that was how you can address it. How you can address this criterion the first way. And then the second way is to demonstrate that the intervention is either widely adopted or soon to be widely adopted. So this one's a little bit fuzzier, but what we mean by this is that we're basically open to evaluating programs that are being widely implemented generally with public funding, but that have not yet been rigorously evaluated, and therefore their effectiveness is unknown. And the idea here is that we can either show that they're working, which would be great, or if not, we can learn that and then divert resources to more effective interventions. So as I was saying, the widely adopted piece of it is a little bit more of a judgment call, but it generally means that the program or intervention is being used in multiple locations across a state or within, for example, a large college system. And then we're also open to evaluating programs that are arguably soon to be widely adopted, meaning that, for example, one organization is doing it and others have expressed a real interest in replicating it, and or actual money is in the process of being committed. Again, it's a little bit of a judgment call, but what the key thing here is that we want you to make a compelling case. It can't just be an idea that a lot of people are talking about, but rather we'd like for you to share some data to demonstrate that it is widely adopted or soon to be. For example, the number of users, number of service providers, or the amount of money that's being spent or proposed to be spent annually. And then in addition, it's even better if you can show us that public officials or administrators are committed to using the evidence from your study. And the best way to do this would be with letters of support, for example. So in both cases, what you need to do in part is to convince us that the intervention that you propose to evaluate is very similar in key components to the intervention that you're either providing the promising evidence for or showing to be in widespread use. So this means on like the dosage and the intensity of the program, the setting, the target population is comparable, or if not, then how they differ and why it matters. And we want you to show that the intervention can be, or preferably already has been, delivered successfully under real-world implementation conditions. Additional to this, in most cases, we'll want to see that it's also being successfully delivered in the proposed study location before the evaluation begins, although this could, for example, be done with a 6-month pilot period that's included in the project proposal if you're taking the program to a new setting. Additionally, with this RFP, it's important to note that we're not looking to fill gaps in the literature here necessarily, or kind of evaluate any program that's addressing an important problem. We all know that there are no shortage of important problems for which we need to find solutions. But our mission here is to really focus on identifying the subset of outstanding solutions that have credible evidence that they can solve these problems. And therefore, we're really looking for some signal that a particular program is worth testing further because we think it might help solve the problem, or that there's a compelling reason to evaluate it because it's widely being used to attempt to address a particular problem. And then finally, I'll just mention that sometimes making the promising prior evidence and/or the widely adopted case can, of course, be a little bit of a stretch. If you think you have something where you could perhaps make both cases, it certainly does not hurt to attempt to do so in the LOI, and then we'll provide feedback on where to focus for the full proposal. Okay. So now I'm going to dive in a little bit more on the requirement for valid study design. So as Jessica spoke to, we're looking for simple, well-powered studies that will convincingly answer the key research question: does the program move the needle on the targeted outcome? So first, with regards to outcomes, we look for studies that will ultimately measure meaningful life or system outcomes, not just process or proxy outcomes or short-term outcomes. If your project is awarded funding, we will ask that you specify 1 or 2 outcomes as primary, and then discuss any other outcomes that you're planning to measure as secondary or exploratory. Or in some cases, we'll ask you to conduct a multiple comparison adjustment if you're specifying more than 2 outcomes and we agree as primary, and we agree that those are important. The main reason for this is that we want to guard against claims of effectiveness when many outcomes are measured and then 1 or 2 are found to be statistically significant, as one would expect by chance. We often get LOIs that propose to measure a zillion outcomes, as we sometimes call it. This isn't a deal breaker. We'll work with researchers to identify the most important primary outcomes together, but it is helpful if you can indicate that you've given this some thought ahead of the LOI submission. In terms of selecting the primary outcomes, it should be something that is easily understood by a layperson or a policymaker as a meaningful improvement. So examples that we've discussed include whether a program ultimately improves individual outcomes such as degree completion, job placement, post-college earnings, debt burden, etc. It's also okay to measure process or near-term outcomes in addition, and sometimes it may be necessary to ensure that things like program take-up or a sufficient treatment contrast are in place, but the ultimate primary outcome should be the main outcome of interest and the outcome to which your study is powered. Additionally, as Jessica discussed, most of our studies occur over multiple years. So we want to see enduring impacts, typically whether effects can be sustained beyond the end of the intervention. Long-term follow-up is truly one of our favorite things. And of course, what defines long-term follow-up depends on the intervention and the outcome, but in most cases, this means at least 1 year beyond the end of the program. I'll talk a little bit about power now. So the proposed RCT needs to have a large enough sample to detect effects that we might reasonably expect to find based on the prior evidence, or that would justify the continued implementation of the program if you've made the widespread use case. It's important to be realistic about this and to take into consideration earlier findings. So for example, if a previous RCT finds that intervention increased college completion by 10 percentage points, then you should have a sufficient sample size so that your replication study can detect a smaller effect, say 5 percentage points. And as a general rule of thumb, we're usually talking about RCTs with sample sizes in the hundreds at least. One additional point on sample size that we regularly see studies that we funded missing their initially proposed sample size targets. This is another reason why we want to ensure that studies are very well powered if they reach their target, because in many cases they're simply not able to. And here, in terms of projecting your study recruitment targets, we would also urge some realism. Finally, I'll just note that we don't typically fund small efficacy trials in more controlled settings or pilot RCTs. Here, we're primarily looking to test programs generally at scale and as they would be implemented in the real world. Next, with respect to the counterfactual, we typically want to see that the program will be measured, that the program's impacts will be measured in the treatment group as compared with a pure control or kind of business as usual group. So for example, we usually don't just want to know how two versions of a program compare to one another. And instead we would want to know if the program is an improvement over and above what participants would be getting anyway. Finally, as I mentioned, we are open, or as we've mentioned a few times, we are open to funding quasi-experimental studies under this RFP. If you're looking to propose such a design, we'll look for two key things. So the first is a really good case that the program cannot be evaluated with an RCT. This needs to be more than simply the implementer doesn't want to randomize. And then the second is a study design that evaluates the program against a credible comparison group. So your best bets here are comparative interrupted time series, regression discontinuity design, or possibly matching or difference in different studies where there's a well-matched comparison group with the groups being highly similar on observables at baseline, and a good case can be made that the two groups are likely to be similar on unobservable characteristics as well. So I'm going to ask Leah to drop a link into the chat. We have a blog post on our Straight Talk website where we've written about what we're looking for in a good quasi-experimental study. And we'd encourage you to review that before submitting an LOI. I think I said lastly on the last one, but we're not quite there. This is the last one on this slide, I believe. We're looking for simple, clear study designs that convincingly answer the primary research question, as we've said. So multi-arm trials, 2x2 factorial designs, step wedge designs, they just, in our view, aren't usually necessary to answer the key research questions that we're primarily asking. We do fund cluster RCTs and occasionally RCTs with more than one treatment arm where we've been convinced that it's important to do so. But the general goal here is a simple, clean design that, again, can ideally be explained to any non-researcher. And this is also relevant for cost considerations. We want studies that are well powered to answer the key question, but not so complicated that they require very large samples that, again, frankly, are often not feasible to begin with. So the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about some things to keep in mind regarding cost considerations and for your study budgets. So just a reminder, you do not need to submit a full budget at the LOI stage. Just a rough estimate of the total study cost is fine. And then if we invite a full proposal, we'll typically work with you on aligning the overall budget with our expectations based on our experiences from other similar studies. So as I think many of you know, a big cost driver is often data collection. We look for data collection to be as streamlined and efficient as possible in order to credibly measure effects on the key primary outcomes. So we're looking to see, like, what do you need to answer the key questions? It's probably not going to be surveys at 3, 6, 12, and 24 months, although perhaps you can convince us otherwise. We generally prefer that outcomes be measured with administrative data. The collection of this tends to be both cheaper and then is often less subject to things going wrong. So great examples in this space are National Student Clearinghouse data, of course, college administrative data, or for example, unemployment insurance data for earnings. These are often preferable to fielding surveys, which can suffer from high and/or differential attrition, recall, or social desirability bias, in addition to generally drastically increasing the budget. But again, if there's a compelling reason for original data collection, we are open to it. The other point I would make is that generally the size of the grant that we're willing to award is in part determined by how well the LOI meets our criteria, especially our promising or widely adopted criterion. So for example, we are willing to provide larger grants to studies of programs that have very promising prior evidence. For example, they have large effects that were found in previous well-conducted single site studies, or in very widespread use and with a compelling demonstration that the evidence produced will be actionable. For example, if a study has suggestive evidence, like from a prior small non-experimental study, we'd be less interested in funding a multi-million-dollar RCT that proposes to deploy several primary data collection efforts. It's a general rule. So as Jessica mentioned, I'm going to take us through a few examples of studies that we've funded in this area. I'll talk through 3 examples, and then Leah is also going to share a link to our website that has brief descriptions of all the RCTs that the evidence-based policy team has funded in multiple policy areas, just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that we look for. So the first one is PT SAIL. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with CUNY's Accelerated Study and Associate Programs, ASAP. That program has been twice shown in well-conducted RCTs to improve graduation rates by more than 10 percentage points in long-term follow-ups. This particular project is an RCT of an adaptation of ASAP. So it's referred to as part-time students accelerating learning, PT SAIL. And it provides the same components of the traditional ASAP program, but is targeted towards part-time students who have completed some credits. So this is an example of an RCT that's evaluating a program with promising prior evidence. It's basically leveraging the ASAP evidence and bringing it to a different target population and with a slightly modified program. The grantee, which is MDRC, aims to recruit a sample of approximately 800 students, and then we'll randomly assign them to either a treatment group offered PT SAIL or to a control group that's getting usual services. And this study's primary outcome will be college graduation 3 years after random assignment, and they're measuring that with administrative records from the National Student Clearinghouse. So to give you some idea, the award for this study was about $570,000 over a 7-year period. And is being widely implemented with significant taxpayer investment. So that was the primary reason for our interest in funding this particular study. In this study, the researchers at Drexel University and the University of Maryland are recruiting incarcerated adults who are interested in pursuing post-secondary education from all of the state correctional institutions in Pennsylvania. Then they're collecting documentation to confirm individuals' program eligibility, and then randomly assigning approximately 350 eligible individuals to receive the offer of a Pell Grant and transfer to a correctional institution that provides access to the qualifying educational programming or to a services as usual group. The primary outcomes here will be recidivism and employment as measured with official administrative records 2 to 6 years after random assignment. And the award for this study was approximately $930,000 over 5 years. Part of the reason for the larger amount of funding here was the difficulty in recruiting, the process of recruiting the sample for this study. So the next one. Great. So some of you may also be familiar with Project Quest. Quest is based in San Antonio, Texas, and supports low-income adults to complete occupational training programs at local community colleges, pass certification exams, and enter well-paying jobs in high-growth sectors of the local economy, such as healthcare. This particular program was evaluated in a well-conducted RCT between 2006 and 2008, in which roughly 400 individuals who were not currently attending college were recruited into the sample and randomly assigned to Quest or to a control group. In 2017, the evaluator published the 6-year follow-up findings, which were based on survey data and found that the program produced an impact of roughly $5,000 in annual earnings per person, which was a very large impact for this type of program. I mentioned earlier that long-term follow-ups are our favorite things, and so this is a good example of that. That's exactly why we funded this study, to extend funding specifically to conduct the long-term follow-up, and we do this quite often, actually. So we funded the grantee Economic Mobility Corporation to extend the study's follow-up in order to both corroborate the survey data finding and then also measure earnings at the 9-year follow-up using administrative data from the Texas Unemployment Insurance System. And the award for this study was about $240,000 over 3 years. So I think that takes us through our presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to Shrutika, who will get us into the Q&A portion.
Thanks very much, Amanda and Jessica. I will start off with the Q&A section. And again, I encourage everyone to please post your questions in the Q&A box. That will just help us manage them. So we've been receiving some really good questions, and I'm going to start off with the first one, which is someone had a question on whether AV prefers to fund the evaluation rather than the actual intervention or program implementation.
Yep, that's a great question. So yes, the short answer is we prefer to fund the evaluation. We can occasionally provide some funding for implementation, although typically this will be in cases where there's a very strong reason to evaluate the intervention and the study cannot go forward without some funding for the intervention. So for example, it would be difficult to recruit a large enough sample size without some additional funding for the program.
Thanks, Amanda. Another question we received is if we consider randomized encouragement designs to be an RCT, since it's not possible to force students to participate in all types of programs.
That is another great question, and the answer is yes. And we have funded some encouragement design studies. I would say, of course, the only challenge here is that they need to be generally quite large samples, but yes, we're definitely open to these types of studies.
Thanks. So another question we had is, would we consider RCTs of programs where the intervention does not affect higher ed students directly? For example, it's directed at high school students and we're interested in looking at outcomes like college enrollment and completion. Would those be considered?
Yes, absolutely. I think actually if you go through some of the examples of studies that we've funded on our website in the post-secondary area, we have several of these types of programs where they kind of start in high school, support high school students, but the ultimate outcomes for this study are post-secondary. And I'm just going to note, since I think Jessica chatted it, she is here, but having some trouble with her camera. So it might just be me on the Q&A, but we will tap her in if we need to.
All right. So another question is an intervention considered to be successful if it accelerates college completion, but the treatment effects fade in the longer term follow-up? So for example, the intervention causes students to graduate earlier than they would otherwise, but does not necessarily increase overall graduation rate.
Yeah, this is also a really good question. I think a little bit of an open question in terms of whether such a program that essentially accelerates graduation, like ultimately improves outcomes beyond that. And so that's, I think, something that we would be interested potentially in studying, especially with regards to workforce outcomes.
Thanks, Amanda. I have a follow-up to the question on whether you consider, say, high school students as a target population. Would we also think about something like what if they target middle schoolers and then it takes about 8 years to see college outcomes?
Yeah, that's another good question. I mean, we do fund extremely long-term studies on occasion where relevant and necessary. So I think we would be open to it. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. And are community colleges considered for funding, or are these RFPs generally aimed at four-year institutions only?
No, that's also a really good question. So we're trying to broadly define post-secondary here. Definitely community colleges are eligible for either as implementing partners with an evaluator or again, potentially as direct grantees. So yeah, the short answer to that is yes. And then even other types of programs potentially.
Yeah, I think similar to that vein, do job training programs, for example, for youth aged 18 to 25 generally count as higher education?
Yeah, I mean, we are definitely interested in funding those types of studies of those types of programs regardless. So I would say that like feel free to submit to this RFP, and if it makes more sense on our end to kind of move it into one of our other RFPs where we fund these types of studies, then we may do that, given that it's a little bit of a gray space. But yes, we're definitely open to that.
Thank you. There is a question on whether we're allowed to include any overhead in the budget.
That's a good question as well. So we do have an indirect cost policy that we include with the budget template that we provide, but the general answer is yes for nonprofits, and someone's going to have to, I think it's 10% for universities and 15% for other types of organizations, but maybe someone can help me out with the exact answer to that.
I'm pretty sure it's 15% for universities and 20 maybe, but we have our indirect cost policy.
We'll send the indirect cost policy as part of the follow-up email.
All right, so we did receive a few questions on specific programs and whether they would qualify for RCTs. I don't think we can assess that here. But if you could talk a little bit more about how we generally assess whether the RFP criterion that the program being evaluated is backed by prior evidence or in widespread use has been met.
Yeah, I mean, I think I talked to this a little bit during the presentation, especially on the widespread use. It's a little bit fuzzy, and even it can be difficult to know like whether or not you're sufficiently meeting our expectations on the promising prior evidence. This is, I mean, in large part why we first request the 3-page LOI. Our hope is that, again, that's where we're mostly looking for you to kind of get over the threshold on that particular criterion. And hopefully it's not too much of a lift on your end to put together the 3-page LOI. So really focusing there. And then what we're doing is we always read the supporting, for example, if it's promising prior evidence, we always read the supporting studies and try to understand two things. One, whether we think that that study really does demonstrate that the program is promising and has been shown to be effective. That's based on the validity of that other supporting study. And then also we do our best to assess kind of how closely the interventions are like how closely related they are. Again, you know, it may be that it doesn't always come through very clearly in the study that you're submitting. So that's where the information that you include in the LOI, being very clear about why you think this particular study is a demonstration of promising prior evidence for the thing that you're trying to evaluate, is very helpful for us. Again, if we're close, if we think that there's some there, we'll typically follow up. Occasionally we'll follow up and ask for more information to support your LOI before deciding whether to invite to a full proposal. Or if we think we're pretty close, we'll go ahead and invite to a full proposal and then provide you with some feedback of things to address in the full proposal to help us feel confident that this particular criterion has been met.
Thanks, Amanda. We do have a slightly more specific question, which is, are proposals to test innovations with medical students eligible for this funding?
Oh, interesting question. Yes. Right. Good question.
Great answer. There is a question on confirming that there are no hard deadlines for the LOIs, and do you think this RFP will remain open indefinitely?
Yes, that is also a very good question. People never believe us when we say that our RFPs are open indefinitely, but some of them have been open for several years now. So there is no imminent plans to take this particular RFP RFP down. And part of the reason why we do this is that our hope is that it allows you time to kind of get everything in order to ensure that, you know, this, like the study that you're proposing, one, addresses all of our criteria and also can be successfully implemented. And it also helps us just kind of manage the flow of proposals that we're reviewing and moving across the line with our board. So yes, for the foreseeable future, this RFP will be open. Again, we accept applications at any point. And we do try to get back to you relatively quickly, for one, to confirm receipt, but then also to let you know whether you're moving forward in the process, regardless. So hopefully that is helpful to reassure folks that this will be here in a few months.
Related to that, there's also a question on what is the total investment that AV is allocating to this RFP?
That's another excellent question. And there is no set cap for this RFP. We will fund as many good studies as we can.
So Amanda, what do you think is the ideal duration of an RCT, and what is the average budget amount that should be requested?
Yeah, so I think we gave, actually, Leah, if you can go back to the slide with like our averages for in this, oh, our PowerPoint disappeared. Hopefully that will come back in a second. And then in terms of duration, so I think, again, there's a few things that we're looking at here. One is that we are looking for sufficient follow-up to sort of to be able to determine that the effects are sustained. So a little bit depends on the duration of the intervention itself, as well as how long it will take you to recruit a sufficient sample size for a sufficiently powered study. So there's a lot of different factors that go into determining how long a study is. You know, if, for example, it's like a 2-month program and you are able to recruit your sample like all at the same time, that would be a miracle, but maybe it can happen. Then, you know, I can see a study duration that's only a couple of years, but often we'll have recruitment for the study sample carry on over 1 or 2 or sometimes longer years. And then also, you know, we often have to wait a long enough time for those outcomes to be available. If we go back to our middle school friends, it will be several years before those outcomes are available. So a lot depends. But yeah, so I think Leah put up the slide here, which is helpful. The one thing I would note is that, again, because we try as much as possible to focus on you know, streamlined data collection, fairly simple designs, etc. And to the degree possible administrative data. A lot of the studies that we fund are under 500,000. The vast majority of them are under 500,000. And then many in that under 500,000, I think, are in the $200,000 to $300,000 range. So hopefully that gives you some sense of what we're looking for. Again, you give us a ballpark estimate at the LOI stage. If based on what we're seeing in terms of the study's design and also kind of how well it's meeting our importance criterion, if we think that the budget estimate that you've put in is just like too much, we'll talk with you about it at the full proposal stage and sort of try to work together to figure out the kind of scope of a study that we would be able to fund.
Thanks, Amanda. Going with what you said in terms of a lot depends on the details, we did receive a question on whether you're open to discussing the study proposal before they submit an LOI.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think now actually I'll ask Leah to go to the last slide of the presentation, because here we have the email address where you can submit LOIs, but also contact information for both Jessica Takeda, who was on the webinar today and who is now having technical difficulties, as well as our colleague on our team, Kiri Dell, who is on the evidence-based policy team. So you can email questions to both, or either or if you know one of them, or however you like. But we're also always happy to hop on the phone to set up a call to discuss whether or not a particular project proposal we think would be eligible for funding under the RFP. So feel free to reach out.
Great. Yeah, I think we have time for one quick last question, which is, can any portion of the budget go towards development of the materials used in the intervention?
That is another really good question. The short answer is that yes, maybe, with a good case being made. A particular example would be something where there's a program or that has strong evidence, but it needs to be adapted for the target population that you are proposing to study. And so I think we would be open to funding part of that development for that purpose. So it's just one example.
Great, thanks, Amanda. So I think, unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. Once again, we really appreciate your participation and the questions you've all asked. And if we haven't been able to address your question, please reach out to Jessica and Kia, as Amanda also mentioned. Their IDs are listed on the slide. And we also another ID for where you can send in your letters of interest. And then most of what we talk about and discuss today is, as well as our indirect cost policy, is available on the RFP, which you should be able to access using this QR code. So we'll wrap up here, and thanks once again for joining us. Hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.